Okay, so on number 12, this is one of the very different problems than all the rest of them. Something that you can't do. You cannot do this and say x squared minus 81 equals 25. You are not permitted to distribute a power of 2 on the outside of a parenthesis if there is a plus or minus sign on the inside of the parenthesis. So see if that's what you did in your work. And if you did, put a big star and say, can't do this, right? You're not allowed to mathematically. Don't do this either. But what you could technically do is write that out twice and then do this foiling like this. This is allowed, and this is how you would have to handle this if you wanted to do that. It would then become x squared minus 18x plus 81 equals 25. You could then move this 25 over and then factor from there, but this is a lot of work, right? And if you want to continue with this, knock yourself out, but that's still not the best way to do this question. The best way to do this question is that if when you have a bubble squared equals 25 and there's no other x in the problem, like you don't see like a plus 2x over here, because that would be an issue that we can't do square root method, right? Remember that you can't do square root method if there's a plain old x in the problem. So if you have just this setup, what you are allowed to do is take the square root of both sides, because then this square root symbol on the left with this square power on the left, they cancel each other out. And so you just get x minus 9 equals, as soon as you do square root, the plus or minus sign shows up, square root of 25. Now this problem is nice because the square root of 25 is a perfect square. It just becomes 5. And then from here, you want to split the problem up into two different equations. So x minus 9 could equal positive 5, or x minus 9 could equal negative 5. You're then going to solve those two equations, and you get 14 or 4. Those are your two answers. Remember that for all quadratic equations, we're looking to get two answers. That's what's the most common thing is going to happen, is you're going to get two answers. This number, example 12, is like the weirdest square root problem. It's the one that's different than all the others. This is splitting up in these two equations here is not something that we normally do, as you'll see in the next examples. All right, so number 13, I can do square root method because there's only an x squared in the problem. There is no x in the problem. So my procedure, my thought process is I want to get this x squared alone, right? I want to isolate it, which means I have to get rid of this 3. How do I get rid of the 3? I'm going to use division. Some people I saw in your homework, you were trying to take the square root on step 1. You can't do that. You have to take the square root once you get the x squared alone. So this is x squared equals 27. Now that you've gotten the x squared alone, this is where you can take the square root of both sides. So that becomes x equals, automatically you get a plus or minus sign anytime you do square root. Square root of 27. Square root of 27 is not a perfect square, so we have to break it down. So what two numbers multiply to make 27, and one of them has to be a perfect square? That's 9 times 3. 9 times 3 is 27, and 9 is my perfect square. So then x equals, bring down your plus or minus sign, the square root of 9 is a perfect square. That just becomes 3. And then this square root of 3 comes down. Number 14. 14 again, we only have an x squared in the problem, so I can do square root method. I want to get this guy alone. So to get rid of the negative 60, I'm going to add 60 to both sides. So 60 equals x squared. Now that I've gotten that x squared alone, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So plus or minus, that shows up right away on the radical. Anytime you take the square root of both sides. Square root of 60 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to break this down. What two numbers multiply to make 60? and one of them has to be a perfect square. 4 times 15. The plus or minus sign comes down. Square root of 4 is a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. Bring down the radical, and that's your answer. Now, at the beginning, I've seen a lot of students do this. They switch the two sides of the equation and then just do the whole problem the same way with the x on the left-hand side. That's fine. For some reason, a lot of people just really like to have that x on the left-hand side. Totally fine. Or you could switch it like in the middle of the problem, like at this point, maybe here. Maybe you switch it and do that and then continue, right? If that makes you happy, sure. All right, number 15. I can do square root method because I have just an x squared in the problem. So I want to get this x squared by itself. So I have two numbers I have to get rid of. I have to get rid of the 100 and I have to get rid of this -5. Which one do I get rid of first, right? The 100. So I'm going to subtract 100 from both sides. 100 minus 100 right here is 0. That's why it cancels out. Be careful. Bring down that negative sign with the 5. That makes a big difference. I now need to get rid of the -5. I'm going to do that with division. So x squared equals 20, right? Positive 20, so we're good. I'm then going to take the square root of both sides. Now that because I got the x squared by itself. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 20. 20 is not a perfect square, so we're going to break it down. I need two numbers that multiply to make 20, but one of them has to be a perfect square. 4 times 5. X equals, the plus or minus sign comes down. The square root of 4 is 2. Bring down the square root of 5, and that's your answer. Number 10. Number 10, I'm allowed to do the square root method because there's just an x squared in the question. There's no x in the question anywhere. So I want to get x squared by itself, right? Imagine if the question had said 16x plus 10 equals 131, right? Hopefully you'd be saying, okay, to solve for x, I would subtract 10 from both sides. It's the same concept, right? So you want to get that x squared alone. So I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. So 16x squared equals 121. I'm then going to divide by 16, just trying to get that x squared by itself. So this gets me a decimal, okay? Using a calculator, if you want to, you can punch in 121 over 16. Try to simplify that fraction. It doesn't simplify. So leave it as this, 121 over 16. Don't change it into a mixed number. That will make the next step difficult. So now that I've gotten the x squared by itself, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. On the left, it gets x equals. Always add a plus or minus as soon as you take the square root of both sides. Square root of 121 over 16. Now, with fractions under a radical, the rule is that you are allowed to break it up into a radical on the top and a radical on the bottom. And what happens is, ran out of space, you get x equals plus or minus. On the top, the square root of 121, that's a perfect square. The square root of 121 is 11. And then on the bottom, the square root of 16, the square root of 16 is 4. 11 over 4, you would simplify that if you could, right? You can't, so this is your final answer.